Welcome once again to our show, and this is Frank Avila, your host. Thank you for watching. I want to thank Chris Anderson on my right, who is my co-host and has been a host many times on this show. And I want to thank my guest, Mick Dumke, who is a investigative journalist, editorialist, and many other things for the Chicago Reader. He's also been at the Chicago Reporter and the New York Times Cooperative. Mick, thank you for being on our show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this show is about legalization of marijuana. Now, we may touch on other subjects, medical marijuana, legalization of all drugs, hard drugs, decriminalization of marijuana, but our focus is primarily on marijuana and the legalization of marijuana, sort of the trends in Illinois, the trends nationwide with states like Colorado, and then maybe what they should do and opinions on that from Mick Dumke, our guest. I want to thank you all for watching, but also thank our studio staff, Tony, Pops, Bill Godomsky, Fred, Tony, and everybody else who makes the show possible here at Cable Access Network TV. Thank you very much. So, Mick, tell us a little bit about your, well, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you said, I'm a reporter. I've been a journalist now for, 15 years. I'm one of those people who did some other things before I went full-time into journalism. I taught high school on the South Side. Okay. I went to seminary and have a Master of Divinity
degree.
School? Sullivan House Alternative High School. Kids who dropped out of the Chicago public school system. Did that for a couple years. I went to seminary and got a Master of Divinity degree. I worked in a homeless ministry, and then I just kept coming back to journalism, and so here I am, quite a few years later, still doing it.
And who do you write for?
I write for The Reader.
Okay.
In case anybody doesn't know, we're the free weekly in town, so long before everyone was worried about news content being given away for free online, The Reader was a free publication. Exactly, a trailblazer.
But they made a lot of money in their ads, so that was their justification for giving it away, because they had a pretty vibrant ad business and personals business.
Absolutely. The Reader, for those old-timers who remember, I shouldn't say old-timers, old-school folks who remember back in the 80s and 90s, it was a 4-section newspaper, and I think the classified section alone was probably as big as the entire publication is now. But, you know, in my humble opinion, I still think we're kicking butt. I mean, we're definitely leaner than we once were, but we have a lot of stuff that doesn't run in the print product anymore. Like all publications, we have a lot of our content that's online only, and, you know, we're survivors. It's great. So I still think we're able to do in-depth quality journalism as well as the arts and entertainment stuff that a lot of people pick it up for.
Well, it's good to pat yourself on the back when you can. So why should somebody pick up The Reader versus the Red Eye or some other free publication that's floating around town?
Well, we're just different. I mean, there's different publications for different interests, and we could go down the list, and I can tell you what I like or dislike about all of them, but I'll just say I think what we do is unique. You can't get it a lot of other places. It's a mix of, like I was saying, arts and entertainment coverage, so if you just want to know what's going on around town, not only can you find out listings and specifics, but you can actually read into a little bit like why this artist is important, why this film is something worth thinking about and going to see. And then I still think we have some of the best political and news coverage in town. We don't cover everything. We have a very small news staff, but what we do, we try to really dive into and talk about, you know, how Chicago actually works. So it's not just what's happening, but why it's happening and how it came to be.
And it's no longer just a North Side paper. You can find it in Pilsen. You can find it in IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, 35th and State Street or wherever.
A lot of dispensaries are Hyde Park.
Yeah, Hyde Park.
Absolutely. We're on the South Side. We're on the West Side. I wish we, frankly, had a bigger print presence all across the city. I mean, to be candid, our main audience is still going to be on the north and the near northwest side, where a lot of young people who go out a lot. That's our bread and butter. So that's going to be our primary distribution point. But no, we consider ourselves a citywide paper. I mean, I think we write more about urban issues, or as much as anybody in town, beyond just the communities that.
And you have some alternative and kind of independent or off the beaten path type of topics and themes also.
That's always been, I think, part of the philosophy of The Reader, is that if everybody's covering something over here, there must be something over here that's worth looking at as well. And so, we try to be in on the conversation that everyone is, things that people are talking about, but we also want to make sure, those stories that aren't being told by other people, we want to try to be there, and we want to try to tell those as well.
So speaking of that, there's a big topic that we said we're going to discuss today, which is marijuana, and you're saying that everybody usually is on one side of the issue. What are you talking about in the reader about as it relates to legalization of marijuana and medical marijuana?
Well, we're certainly not the first people who have done this. I mean, people have been writing about drug issues and the so-called war on drugs and stuff since it started 40-some years ago. But I think most recently, the conversations that are going on in Illinois and going on in Chicago, I think the reader's been right in the middle of and even out front on some of them. So a couple years ago, my colleague Ben Jarofsky and I started looking at who was getting arrested and who was getting prosecuted and then who was getting convicted of marijuana-related offenses. And we found it's probably not a big surprise to a lot of people, although the numbers actually surprise us. So we found that, while usage rates are generally found to be pretty similar across racial and ethnic groups, that most of the people getting busted for it here are African American. So it's like 78%, at that time, 78% of everyone arrested. I think it was 89% of everyone who was prosecuted for it, and then 92% of everyone who ended up being incarcerated for marijuana possession charges, just possession, was African American.
So there's clear racial disparities just from a statistical point of view.
That's right. We call it the grass gap. So there's this huge racial gap around this substance that is widely used by all different groups.
Now, I should break in just for a second. Some of you may have seen Chris Anderson on this show before on the war on drugs. And this kind of plays into it. So Illinois Committee for Honest Government, Issue 4, myself, Frank Avila, Chris Anderson have a history of talking about these issues and even advocating taking public policy stands. Now, I want to make sure that I'm clear to the viewing audience that you can take a public policy stand for legalization of medical marijuana, for decriminalization of marijuana, and even legalizing marijuana, or even viewing drugs as a psychological, psychospiritual, medical issue rather than just a criminal issue, and not support drug use, even just marijuana use that may be the most innocuous of the harder drugs or the illegal drugs. So I want to make sure that's clear that one could advocate for a specific policy position and not advocate for illegal drug usage. And I think that's really important because I don't want people that, are viewing on start writing letters and sending me emails and calls when they see me, Frank Avila and the Illinois Committee for Honest Government are saying that we should all start smoking weed. This is not High Times or the Rastafarian show or anything else like that. But I think that
people were always wondering what you were on, Frank, all these years. So now the truth is coming out.
But I think that one can
Just
look at the view marijuana specifically in a more rational way, that what works and doesn't work. And I think that merely locking up minorities, specifically African Americans, but I think that some of the numbers would be somewhat the same or similar for Hispanics, that Hispanics would have higher incarceration rates and arrest rates for weed alone than the population at large or the Caucasian population.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's like, the darker your hue, the more likely you are to be caught up in this thing. And that's perhaps a crude way to put it, but it's the truth of the matter, honestly.
Right. And again, I don't know if there's any other reasons for that. Location, if people also had other criminal histories, I don't know. But I think there's a problem. At least, it's an alert, it's a siren that there's a problem. And I think that with all the other crime going on in Chicago, has a very high crime rate, higher crime rates than, or even higher incidents of crime, specifically in murder, than New York or LA, which are much larger cities. That why wouldn't our monies be spent better by focusing attention on violent crimes rather than this drug uses in general? Usually the drug addict is someone who's a problem, has a personal problem. They're more of a medical or psychological issue than I think a criminal issue.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think, at the very least, our intention in reporting on this has been to have a discussion about what is the best way to use our limited resources when it comes to criminal justice. Why are we picking up kids on the street carrying around dime bags? Or we can have the conversation if you want later about even if they're carrying around heroin, they're a low-level dealer or low-level user, perhaps an addict. Why are we spending resources picking those people up, taking them into the court system, locking them up, spending $150 a day on average to jail them and then potentially send them downstate if they've gotten in trouble before, giving them a record and so on, when we have serious issues with, for instance, gun violence and people getting killed here. And I think some people would come in here and say they're not disconnected from one another, that some violence is associated with the drug trade, and there are people who are picked up on drug charges because frankly, the police want to get them off the street and they don't have anything else to pick them up for, but they suspect that they're up to something else. They're gang bangers. They've caught them before with guns, and this time they just happen to catch them with pot or something. So they do have. There is some reasoning behind why some of these arrests are occurring, or they just want to go clear out a particular space.
Well, I've
where
seen that
violence
happen
has
too, where
happened.
everybody on a certain block is arrested, and then to be fair, usually the police just drop the charges. But for whatever reason, at that time, they wanted to pick everybody out of the block and maybe only prosecute one person. I don't know why. I don't really understand that policing strategy. People have tried to explain it, argue it to me. I don't really agree with it. But let me ask you another
I think
question.
it causes. I'll just quickly say, I think it actually. There may be some reasons for it, but I think it causes a lot of harm actually in the community too.
Because of distrust with the police?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, even when there is distrust over other issues, the sense that some potentially low-level knuckleheads are getting picked up and thrown in, into lockup. When guys who may actually be up to something that's serious, they may be carrying guns or whatever, when they may not be swept up at the same time, or that they're all treated equally. Like all these crimes are treated equally when they're clearly not of the same level of gravity. That doesn't necessarily make a good impression across the community.
Well, there's clearly a problem with confidence and trust in lower income minority communities and the police. I don't think that's any secret, even today. Maybe it's improved, I don't know. Even with caps and community policing, I still don't think that it's where it should be or could be. But along those lines, let me ask you another question, though. Is there any link between illegal drug use, or specifically marijuana use, and links to criminality, any of people committing other crimes? Is there any statistical link that people who smoke marijuana or even in general use illegal drugs, that they're more likely to commit crimes?
I've never heard any research like that says that. I mean, look, millions, tens of millions of Americans use marijuana every year, and most of them have nothing to do, never encounter the criminal justice system, never move on to harder drugs. Now, the reverse isn't necessarily true, and by that I mean, I think most of the people in jail, there have been studies about this, test positive for some kind of illegal substance, and marijuana is going to be the most common one of those for sure. So, and I've anecdotally, you talk to people who have been involved with carrying guns or acts of violence or deeply in the drug trade. A lot of them are using often a lot of different kinds of substances pretty heavily. I mean, when you're caught up in that world, I think there's a certain emotional numbness that you need to continue, especially if you're a street enforcer, you're involved in violence or something like that.
So,
but to be clear, I think the opposite is absolutely a preposterous thing to make. I mean, do a lot of people who end up murdering their wives in domestic violence, do they end up being drunk or using alcohol? I suspect that a lot of them do, but most people who use alcohol don't do that. And I think the same is true statistically for marijuana.
So you actually touched on something I thought was really interesting, saying that if you're involved in a certain type of lifestyle, it's almost like the person is self-medicating. I was going to ask, do you have any studies on that? And then also you touched on it, but if you could give us more concrete numbers. But actually, going away from the concrete numbers, if you could talk about your experience having taught high school, having been in the community, going to seminary. Statistically, they say there's no gateway causality from marijuana to harder drugs. But what have you seen firsthand? So can you talk about what you've seen firsthand and also talk about the other subject?
Well, I think people think about the gateway because it is true that most people who end up getting addicted to cocaine or crack or heroin, they have used marijuana, and they've almost certainly used alcohol. A lot of them, by the way, have also used legal pharmaceuticals, maybe that they started misusing or raided their parents' medicine cabinets or stuff like that. So it is true that most people stair step up to, say, heroin. But it's absolutely not, the reverse is not true, that most people who use marijuana go on to heroin. There's no evidence whatsoever that one thing leads to another. If you end up being someone who's going to try hard drugs, usually you've dabbled in other things. There's actually a pretty compelling argument, I think, to be made that drug education, as we've had it for certainly the last 30 or 40 years, is pretty inadequate, and that it treats all drugs the same way. And so if someone does try marijuana and they're like, wow, look, I kind of enjoyed this, it wasn't that big of a deal, heroin may not be that different. Well, it is very, very different. It's a much more dangerous drug. It's much more addictive. And so all drugs are not the same.
I've heard that before, but I don't know if it's true that just because they tell you not to smoke marijuana, and drug education varies because sometimes they do go into the symptoms, and obviously crystal meth is far worse, and cocaine addiction is far more addictive, et cetera, et cetera. However, that just to say that, well, if they say marijuana is bad and now I like it, I'm going to use heroin, I'm not sure if that's true. That was even posited in a movie that I saw, like an HBO documentary.
Well, most people don't use heroin. Again, in the general population, in the marijuana-using population, the heroin users is a very small population relative to what we're talking about. So that again, is a point we have to keep making over and over again. We're talking about relatively small populations. But I'm just saying, if there is any sort of gateway, I think it's this notion that they're all the same. But I don't disagree with you, Frank. I just don't think that most people springboard from marijuana, like there's a natural springboard from marijuana to heroin. There's absolutely no statistical evidence to support that.
And then self-medicating, as far as, has that been something that's been a lot of research about, or is that just something you've seen and drawn conclusions on?
Well, anecdotally, for sure. I mean, I did a few stories. This is getting a little bit away from the marijuana legalization, but doing a few stories about the heroin trade last year. And once I started talking to guys who are in federal prison, they've been convicted for being part of heroin conspiracies, and most of them are, had a career out in the street. Almost all of them, in one way, shape, or form, were self-medicating with something. I mean, it's hard work. It's dangerous work. And so, and it's available to you. I mean, the way you're paid is actually in drugs. If you're working on the corner, you're usually given, like on the west side, I think it's like you're given 13 dime bags of heroin, and you have to essentially return the proceeds for 10 of them. So 3 of them, you can either keep the heroin or you can sell the other 3, and that's your payment.
Now, we did a series of shows with the National Alliance of Mental Illness, NAMI, and almost universally when we did the shows with some mentally ill people, some of them who were very successful that looked the same as anybody else, but they said that they did self-medicate, either with prescription narcotics used in a different manner than they were intended to, or through marijuana, or even through other drug use. So I definitely think that people use illegal drugs, including marijuana, for a self-medication, either from stress or trauma, mental illness, or whatever it may be.
Absolutely. People use wine and beer and whiskey for the same thing. And I'm not again saying that's the same as heroin or the same as marijuana. These are all different substances. But yes, the varieties of religious experience by William James, classic work, sociological work on religion. There's a whole chapter in there about basically the use of mind-altering substances. And so I just think it's part of human nature in one way to want to explore through chemical experimentation, but specifically pain and the existential reality of living in the modern world. I think people do self-medicate a lot.
But I think the difference between William James's book, let's say talking about peyote with American Indians or other hallucinogenics with shaman or whatever else, is these weren't used recreationally. They were used actually in somewhat of a select type of environment, protected, where you're around other people, used in the form of a ritual. So it wasn't used recreationally, because I know a lot of people use that as some excuse why they may use illegal drugs, even when I was growing up. But I think there's something very substantially different between Apache Indian or a Yaqui Indian using peyote in a religious ceremony and somebody using mushrooms or acid or crystal meth recreationally in a non-religious context.
I totally agree, but I can guarantee you that there were Indians who used peyote because they wanted to get high. I can almost guarantee it. I mean, again, we're getting a little far afield here, but you know, in the New Testament, you have the Apostle Paul lecturing some of, you know, newly converted Christians not to drink too much. I mean, you know, but yet the Last Supper, they were all drinking wine. So clearly there were people, there was a part of formal, you know, process. It was in the instance of the Last Supper, it was a Seder, and so they were drinking wine as part of the Seder, but there were people who abused it too.
But the drinking wine in that context was not for an altered consciousness state.
Why else do people drink wine?
Well, I think
Frank?
wine
Come
tastes
on.
good, and I think that you could have a mild amount of wine that you drink. I don't think
Grape
people are.
juice tastes good too, but people prefer wine. Okay.
But I think that drinking a fermented beverage is not necessarily an altered conscious like you would have with peyote or with crystal meth or something else like that.
Well, there are different substances with, and I've never used any of those things except wine. But I think fundamentally, if we're talking about why people use these substances, it's because they want to alter their consciousness, and so I don't think, in that sense, it's that different, the use of alcohol versus the use of drugs that we've deemed illegal.
Perhaps it's the same in principle, but it's certainly different in degree.
Absolutely, and they're different substances and they have different effects.
Right.
No disagreement.
But I think that besides alcohol, which has always been culturally acceptable, and I think
Right.
the culturally acceptable thing is an important element of it.
I agree.
That cultural acceptance is it's important, I would say, but it also is kind of a baseline of acceptable behavior. But the difference I think you see with recreational drugs today, and perhaps like you said in the last 40, 50 years, you've never seen the level of recreational drug use that you've seen in modern times ever. Because, yes, maybe other Indians took peyote and they wanted to save it, but it wasn't like peyote was massively available. You know, you had to get them from the cactus. You know, they had to, you know, it wasn't like people were doing peyote every day. And then if they were, they couldn't function, whether it be to fight or to hunt or to do whatever they wanted to do.
Well, you know, we have such a lens on this stuff now. I'm not willing to say that it's actually that the use of things is different or more substantial than in previous times. I mean, the reason that opium and heroin and you know, and cocaine were taken out of pharmacies, because at one point in time these were all drugs that were prescribed. Let's not forget. The reason this all changed is because there was a perception that it was being abused. The reason we went into alcohol prohibition was because, you know, yes, we can all sit here and say now that it was a failed experiment. It was really bad public policy on so many levels. But, you know, there were some real reasons why people decided to try that, because there was widespread abuse of alcohol. People were getting drunk. You know, back in that time, you know, people were walking away from their families. It was a huge social problem. And there's a reason why all 50 states eventually ratified, you know, this amendment, because, you know, they saw it as a problem.
I don't think 50 states did. I think like 36
They had
did.
enough. You're right. Enough to put. But the
nonetheless,
point is, we
you're right,
changed the Constitution, and it wasn't. Yes, there were some brilliant strategists who pushed this through, perhaps against the will of many people, but there was a perception that this was a real problem.
But one thing that did happen under Prohibition, there was a decrease in alcohol consumption.
That's right. So in that sense, they accomplished some of their goal. And these are progressives, don't forget. Right. These are not necessarily, you know, well, I guess in some ways you could say they were misguided prudes, if that's your opinion. But at the time, this was considered part of the progressive movement. These were some of the same people who were pushing for women's suffrage, for, you know, child care.
The women's suffrage
agencies.
movement was very tied into the temperance movement.
That's right, exactly.
Well, so let me shift gears for a second. Is one of the arguments is if you decriminalize or legalize marijuana, this is one example, you take the criminal element out of marijuana, so maybe if people were prone to criminality because they were getting into that subculture, that they're no longer going to do it because they can use marijuana either as a pill or in some kind of liquid form, or even smoke it legally, or sometimes even like in the Netherlands, they do put it in food, brownies, et cetera, et cetera.
You can get that in Colorado now, right?
So there's still an illegal market though for children, because I don't think anybody's saying that the under 18 crowd should have legalized marijuana, because I mean marijuana.
Except for the under 18 crowd, yeah.
Well, but marijuana is linked to triggers of mental illness, issues in development. If kids, you know, on the last show we had a judge who said kids are having kids. There are, if people are smoking marijuana when they're pregnant, There's issues of deformities and of birth defects. I even know people that happened to, the mother and the father are both smoking, and the children had birth defects. So it's not that marijuana is completely innocuous. So what do you do then about the other 18 crowd who does want to smoke? Because a lot of these kids do start smoking when they're 12, 13, 14, maybe 15, 16. I mean, most people don't wake up when they're 25 and say, I want to have a joint or something like that.
Well, I think you just answered your own question. They're doing it now. I mean, so.
But you certainly, nobody's saying that they're going to legalize it for kids. But
No.
But what percentage is doing it now? Is it 30%, 40%, 50%, 20%? So if you legalized it, you're not going to legalize it for kids. So there still has to be a legal market for kids.
Yeah, and there probably will be. There's an illegal market for alcohol for kids.
But
They
if you
steal it
still
from
have
their
the
parents,
illegal
somebody
market,
buys
you
it.
still have all the same motivations of criminality. So you can't take the criminality just by legalizing it for adults unless you are
Yeah,
saying...
but you're right. But I mean, I think it's just, let's apply this logic to alcohol, that it's not a substantial enough market that we decided that the whole, that's enough to stop us from doing what's logical and what seems like good public policy. It's a substance that the public demands, or at least a segment of the public demands. And while it's certainly not free of health risks, it appears from the available science and years of anecdotal evidence that we have that it's certainly not any more harmful than other things that are legal. So it just doesn't seem like good public policy to keep it illegal.
So can you talk about the Colorado experiment? We're only probably less than 60 days into it.
Right.
In Colorado, the biggest complaint I think has been lack of sourcing.
That's right.
That they ran out of legal marijuana, I believe, about 2 weeks ago. But what's going on there? I'm sure that you have friends in the field and you've done your own research. Have you seen any immediate results that you can share with us?
I think it's too soon to tell, really. Like you said, it's just been a few weeks since this happened, and you're right. I think that the storylines we're hearing out of Colorado right now is long lines and not enough, weed available. Mm-hmm. And by the way, they wouldn't call it weed; they would call it cannabis, because it's a product. It's not just a weed. In fairness, this is all carefully cultivated.
Colorado's gone
now.
much farther than Illinois. Governor Quinn was much more cautious in what he was supporting, and the legislature crafted something that was much, much, much more limited in. And I said much, much more because it is much more limited than in Colorado. But one of the arguments people have always posited for legalizing marijuana is revenue, and that you can legalize it, tax it, and I think there's some merit to that. So has Colorado's economy, has the revenues of the taxation, have they gone up, 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 up?
Well, I don't think we know yet. I mean, it's only been a few weeks. It appears that business is booming, but I don't know what the cost of regulation is going to be. I don't know, what the costs of enforcing the law are going to be. There was actually a really great, anybody who's interested in this, I would encourage you to go online and find it. There's a really great article in the New Yorker within the last month and a half, where they went and basically followed a policy guy around in Washington State, which also is going through this. They're a few months behind, but where they're trying to figure out exactly how to make this thing work. And it's not quite as simple as you would think, because we were just talking about the black market. In order to basically cut into the black market, you have to make sure that the price is set at a certain level and that the product is available to enough people, but not too many people at the same time. And one of the arguments there from this gentleman who is this consultant to the state is that you actually need to have a crackdown on illegal marijuana users, people who are not following the rules of dispensing marijuana, because if you don't, then you allow the underground economy to continue to thrive.
But don't you have the war on drugs all over again then?
Well, the idea is that it's a short-term thing, and you're pushing it
driving the market
legal.
a different way.
You're right, exactly. So my understanding is when prohibition of alcohol ended, it wasn't automatically like one day it was this and the next day it was this. I mean, there was a lot of transition time that happened. So you have to go from people going to their neighborhood bootlegger or whatever to getting them used to going back to a tavern or a legal alcohol operation. And different states still to this day have different systems for regulating